Good afternoon. You can do better than that. Good afternoon. Much better. This is the rated session of the previous one, similar to the previous one, but this is going to be a little bit more subtle, hopefully. Well, welcome to the 32nd anniversary of the Miami Book Fair. My name is Raif Yassin. I'm new volunteer host for the book fair. And this afternoon, we're very delighted to have you. If you look throughout the schedule of event today, you'll see many activities that will take us through. So hopefully you like them. Plus, there's activity for Children Alley and programs in the swamp and the porch and much more. Okay. Now, please consider to be part of the Friends of the Book Fair. Okay. This is how they get contribution to make this event happen. And this year it got even better. You get a lot of preferential seating when you become part of the book for your friends. If you have a smartphone, you can simply go text, I don't even do texting anymore. Anyway, text book to 501501. If you can repeat this twice, you get an award. And to donate $10. Once you text that, you'll donate $10. You get a text back, said, do you want to still pay $10? You said yes, and you're done. And you become a friend of, part of the Friends of the Book Fair. We cannot do anything without thanking our sponsors for this event, the Knight Foundation, OHL Ariano, and the Bachelor Foundation, and so many more listed in your brochures. Okay, Miami Book Fair does not end today. There are many more activities through the years, so you can follow it at Miami. You can follow through with this. Miami-Dade is very grateful to have one of the sponsors of the Miami Book Fair. Okay, after this, we have an introducer, and after this, there's going to be a Q&A. So please, I'm going to ask you to be brief, and because these guys can talk. And if anybody know authors, they can really talk for a long time. So we want to make sure that everybody have a chance to talk. So be very brief and objective with your question. After the Q&A, there will be outside to the right a book signing by the authors, and now, the next thing I ask you to do, please silence your cell phone, and that including myself, what I just did a few minutes ago. So it doesn't disturb the author or the audience. And for now, I want to introduce our introducer, Craig Torchy, to come and introduce our authors and presenters. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name's Craig Torchy. I'm the director of the Miami Law Innocence Clinic at the University of Miami Law School, and it's my great honor to be here introducing this session today. Stephen Rosenthal is a partner at Pothurst Orsak. He's a rare attorney in that he's both a terrific trial lawyer and an outstanding appellate litigator. He focuses his practice on representing individuals in complex litigation matters. He was appointed previously to serve as lead Florida counsel in Barack Obama's re-election campaign, where he supervised 4,500 volunteer attorneys dealing with voter protection issues. Stephen was raised in Miami and remains committed to public service here and community involvement with his work with the Legal Services of Greater Miami. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School and Harvard College and Harvard Law School, where he was one of Professor Dershowitz's students. After graduating from Brooklyn College and Yale Law School, Professor Dershowitz joined the Harvard Law faculty at the age of 25. Wrap your head around that one for a bit. He then became the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law and has become, over the years, one of the most well-known, famous lawyers in the world. He's published over 1,000 articles in periodicals, journals, blogs, newspapers, 30 fiction and nonfiction publications, including the New York Times #1 bestseller, Chutzpah. But Professor Dershowitz's influence goes far beyond his contributions to legal scholarship and literature. I was introduced to his work 25 years ago as a first-year law student, when my criminal law professor, who happened to be one of Professor Dershowitz's students, assigned us to read a book called The Best Defense. And in that book, Professor Dershowitz talks about being the lawyer of last resort. And that resonated with me then, and it still does today. Because the idea of being the last person standing between your client and the unlimited power of the government inspired me to become an appellate lawyer and a legal educator. And I'm sure my story is similar to thousands of other people who are inspired by him. So on behalf of all those people, thank you.
Thank you.
And now, Professor Dershowitz is going to go on a no-holds-barred historical review of Jewish lawyers, starting with the biblical Abraham and leading up to current litigators who have changed the world by refusing to accept the status quo. So please give a warm welcome to Stephen Rosenthal and Alan Dershowitz.
Thank you. Alan, it's a great privilege of mine to be able to have this conversation with you.
And it's a great privilege of mine to be on the same stage with you.
Well, thank you. And so what we'll do is we'll do some questions up here for a while,
Right.
and then hopefully there'll be some time for questions from the audience.
Great.
Okay. And so I can say with honesty that 20 years ago, I remember distinctly being in your class. I had only a very short course with you, and one of the messages that you brought home that has stayed with me, frankly, one of the few messages I can remember from law school, is to speak truth to power. And that theme plays into your current book,
Right.
as it has through many of your writings. And you've written so widely on different things. In what way does a book about Abraham with biblical origins implicate this concept of speaking truth to power?
Oh, no doubt about that. I mean, I first met Abraham. I'm not that old, but I first met Abraham as a 7-year-old in yeshiva, Jewish parochial school, and I couldn't believe that the rabbis assigned me to read about a man who was arguing with God, who was saying to God, "How dare you? The judge of all the world will not himself do justice? Are you going to sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? Far be it from you." Oh my God, I said, this is my kind of guy. Of course, I started arguing with my rabbis. They didn't take it so kindly. So it got me into trouble right from the beginning. And I was born with the name Abraham. Avraham is my Hebrew name. And I was known as Avi until I was 20 years old. My mother decided I needed a real name to go to college, so they came up with Alan. And so Abraham has inspired me right from the beginning. And, you know, I argue in front of federal judges who think they're God. But the idea of arguing to God is a remarkable concept in a religion. No other religion has had that kind of approach. And you wonder why Jews become argumentative or lawyers. God called us the stiff-necked people, and we argue with everybody. So arguing truth to power has been part of a great tradition, not only of Jewish lawyers, but of great lawyers everywhere.
Well, let me ask you this question. You've written on subjects involving civil rights, philosophy, law, of course. You've written novels,
Right.
Great trials and cases. Why a book on Abraham and how it applies to the legal tradition?
One of the reasons I wanted to write about Abraham is a uniting figure. He is the father of 3 great religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And it gave me an opportunity to take the stories of Abraham and to read what the Islamic approach to them was, what the Christian approach. Take, for example, the most famous story of Abraham. Everybody knows this story, known in Hebrew as the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. You have 2 stories right in a row. First, Abraham argues with God about strangers, the sinners of Sodom. And then God comes to Abraham and says, take your son, your only son, the one you love, bring him to the mountain and sacrifice him. Here's an innocent person being sacrificed, and Abraham doesn't say a word. Sure, God, here I am. I'll take him, and I'll sacrifice him. And you have to ask yourself the question, is this the same Abraham? Why was he so argumentative in chapter so-and-so and then so compliant in the next chapter? And it made me look hard. And so, of course, the Christian interpretation of the sacrifice of Isaac is consistent with the New Testament. Abraham was asked to sacrifice Isaac as a prelude to God sacrificing his own son, Jesus. In fact, in some of the Christian commentaries, it says that Abraham actually killed Isaac, and then God resurrected him the way he resurrected Jesus. In the Islamic tradition, of course, it wasn't Isaac at all. It was Ishmael, who was to become the leader of the Arab nation. And he's the one who's sacrificed. And so you have the same story essentially serving as a Rorschach test. And if you look at almost any event in today's news, you can find something that resonates with the story of Abraham. Take the issue of how do we deal with Syrian refugees who are seeking to escape from what's going on there and to come to our country. Well, Abraham opened his house to everybody. He welcomed all guests. He rescued his nephew Lot, who was captured by the kings. So, of course, you can give a different interpretation, too. That's the beauty of the Bible. It can be interpreted and has been interpreted differently by different religions and different generations within the same religion. So, I've said before, if I were stranded on a desert island and I had all my students from Harvard Law School and only one FedEx box, I could get only one book, and I needed one book to teach them law, literature, history, philosophy, morality, it would be the Bible. And it's no accident that the Bible is the best-selling book in the history of the world because it's so enduring. And you can accept that whether you are like me, a skeptic. Do I know whether God wrote the Bible? I don't know. Was I there? I never accept hearsay. So, but the God I'm skeptical about is the Jewish God of the Bible. So, or you can be, in fact, the back of the book has 3 blurbs. One by a rabbi, the chief rabbi of England, Jonathan Sacks, one by a Protestant minister, Harvey Cox, and then one by a couple who are fervent atheists, Steven Pinker and Rebecca Goldstein. So, you can read it no matter what your religious or non-religious perspective is.
One of the things that I thought was interesting that you did in the book is you've used these sort of common themes from Abrahamic times to pick out examples of people throughout history from all over the world, different periods of time, who exemplify different aspects of that tradition. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's what I tried very hard to do. Look, Abraham shatters idols, and there have been lawyers who have been idol shatterers. If you look at the lawyers who represented Nelson Mandela during his attempt to dismantle apartheid, they were almost all Jewish lawyers. If you look at the founders of Israel, the Zionists, they were almost all Jewish lawyers. Herzl was a lawyer, Ben-Gurion was a lawyer, Begin was a lawyer. Most of them were lawyers, idols. If you look at some of the early communists, Trotsky was a lawyer. And for better or worse, you find a lot of lawyers are idol shatterers. And you find lawyers who argue with authority, and you find those who don't. So my favorite combined story in the book is about a Jewish lawyer and a non-Jewish lawyer, and the non-Jewish lawyer emerges as the hero. His name is Jan Karski. How many of you have ever heard the name Jan Karski? It's amazing, because he's one of the most important people in the history of the Second World War. Jan Karski was a Catholic graduate, recent graduate of the Lvov Law School, and his mission was to tell the world what was happening to the Jews. And he got himself an Estonian uniform of a guard, and he went into the death camps, and he watched what was going on, and he took careful notes, and he was caught by the Gestapo and tortured, and was told he would, and they put out a wanted poster for him to be killed. And he went to a dentist and had all of his teeth knocked out so that he could look different. And he went back to another death camp, Belzec, and he again took notes. And he finally got out, and he made it to England where he was debriefed, and then he was sent to America to meet with Justice Felix Frankfurter, the great American Supreme Court justice who was so close to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he told him what he had seen. And Frankfurter looked at him and said, at a time like this, a man like me must be totally honest with a man like you. I cannot believe a word you're telling me. And he refused to bring him to Roosevelt. And so here you have an idol shatterer, obviously, a man who was prepared to break his own teeth and do whatever it took to save the lives of innocent Jews, and a compliant person who just cared more about his relationship with Franklin Delano Roosevelt than he cared about his people being murdered in Germany. So those are the kinds of stories I tell in the book. Good guys, bad guys. Unfortunately, mostly guys, because when I was writing about lawyers in the past, tragically, there weren't enough women. I do write about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I write about Elena Kagan. But the next book will be a lot about women because women will be dominant in the legal profession.
Hear, hear. So it's interesting that you talk about both the positives and the negatives of some of these traditions that you identify with Jewish lawyering going all the way back to Abraham, some of which are most beneficially exemplified by non-Jews, as you just explained. Was there any concern on your part? I mean, you've been a very big open advocate for Jewish causes in Israel. Did it concern you at all to write about some of these negative attributes of some of these prominent Jews historically?
No, I think it's very important to tell the truth. I support Israel, but I'm always prepared to criticize Israel when I think Israel has made mistakes. I think if you're going to be credible, you have to tell the truth about your friends as well as about your enemies. If you're going to believe about your enemies, you have to be believed about your friends. And nobody's perfect. And one of the beautiful things about the Jewish Bible is that nobody's perfect in the Jewish Bible. There are no perfect characters. Everybody's deeply flawed. Jesus is perfect. Muhammad is perfect. Moses, not so much. David, not at all. Abraham, deeply flawed. And so I think in the tradition of Abraham in the Bible, it was important for me to point out the flaws in some of the Jewish leaders. Look, 2 years ago, I wrote my own autobiography, and I went out of my way to try to point out my flaws. Maybe I didn't point out enough, but we all have flaws, and we're human. And that's what's so great about the Bible. It's about human beings dealing with their flaws and trying to struggle for justice. And it's always a struggle. The Bible says, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice, must thou run after and seek actively, but you'll never catch it. There'll never be perfect justice in the world. All we can do is seek to obtain it through the procedures of justice.
So what are some of the things you're hoping to teach? Because even though I know you've retired from Harvard Law School,
Right.
You're always the teacher. What does this book seek to educate about?
Well, first of all, you can never stop teaching. My friends now get so upset with me because I don't teach anymore at Harvard Law School. So when I get together with them, I do a little too much preaching and teaching because I can't get over it. And I'll probably do a little of that today here as well. The teaching that I wanted to talk about is that philosophy grows out of experience. We learn about rights from seeing wrongs. We learn about how the law should be from seeing how the world is imperfect. And I try to give story after story about the learning experience. The interesting thing about the Jewish God is also different from the Christian God and the Muslim God. Again, both the Muslim and the Christian God are perfect. The Jewish God isn't perfect. He learns. Abraham argues with him and persuades him to change his mind. When he brings the flood, God says, the Bible says about God that he regretted creating human beings. A perfect person with complete foresight wouldn't regret. And that's why Jewish religion has a concept of tikkun olam, repair of the world, because nothing's perfect, not even God. The God of the Bible is a learning God. At one point, God says to Moses, go through a city and kill all the people. And Moses says, we'll try to go through the city without killing anybody. And God says, yeah, that's the better way to do it. You get a God who isn't always perfect. You get a God who loses his temper. The flood. I mean, my God, one of the reasons that Abraham yells at God, how dare you sweep away the innocent with the guilty, is he was referring to the flood. God did sweep away the innocent with the guilty. You can never find a world in which there are no innocent people. Babies just born, obviously, are innocent. So you have a God who learns and who develops. And that's part of the thesis of my book, is that learning is a never-ending phenomenon. We can never, ever stop learning. If the quest for justice never stops, the quest for learning never stops.
Well, on that vein, what would you impart to people who are in this audience and also who read your book, and they should because it's very well written and interesting, what should they take away from these messages of betterment of the world, tikkun olam, and standing up for things that are important?
Well, if you look at what's going on in the world today, you talk about 50 years at Harvard. I have to tell you, my one big disappointment is not with the students. I was very, very happy with the students. My big disappointment in 50 years of teaching, and I taught not only at Harvard, I taught at other elite, I was a visiting professor at a number of other schools. I've never seen a group of less courageous people than tenured faculty. They refuse to speak out, and tenure is all about speaking out. So, for example, look at what's going on today in the newspapers. Students are demanding safe spaces for themselves where their ideas won't be challenged. God forbid a 21-year-old student will have his ideas challenged. I went to Johns Hopkins University to deliver the Milton Eisenhower lecture 2 weeks ago, and there were protesters. They're saying Dershowitz has views we disagree with, and these are not debatable views. You cannot debate the Middle East. It said, I was harassing the students by not admitting that Israel commits war crimes against the Palestinians. Now, let's get this straight. By my silence, I was harassing the students, as if they had a right to have me say what they wanted to have me say. Stalin would be proud. You get students now at Princeton University saying, we will not leave the president's office. We will engage in a sit-in, threatening even violence unless the president agrees to certain demands. The president agrees to the demands. You get, this was my favorite. I think it's Smith College, or maybe it was Mount Holyoke. Mount Holyoke. The students wanted to put on a play called The Vagina Monologues. And, you know, the old days, schools would be upset because it was a little too risque. In this case, a group of students said, no, you cannot put on the vagina monologues because it doesn't take into account women without vaginas, namely transgendered women. And it would be unfair to transgendered women to have a play about vaginas. This is literally true. Google it. Now, you think the answer to that is write a play about women without vaginas. Write a play about men without penis. You know, write your own play, but don't stop other people with vaginas from enjoying a play. So that's the way it's going today on colleges and universities. In Dartmouth, students yell, we want a safe place, and they barge into a library, which is the safest of places to study, and they scream at the students, give them the finger, intimidate them, say, how dare you be studying? You must join our cause. At Smith College, they said the only journalists that should be allowed to cover our events are journalists who take an oath that they support our point of view and will write favorably about us. I mean, is this Iran? It's absolutely remarkable. And the response from the presidents of universities, silence. Complicity, compliance. Yes, students, if there are enough of you, you must be right. And so we have to learn to speak back. And, you know, people say, oh, they're only students. Who were the people who started burning books in 1933? It was the students at the university in Munich. It was the students in the University of Berlin. Who were some of the worst Stalinist offenders during the purges? Students. Who were the ones in the Second World War at the Oxford Union who took a pledge that we will not fight against Nazism? Students. So I take students seriously. I treat them like adults. And they get very upset because they want to be treated like adults when it comes to sex, when it comes to drugs, when it comes to their personal life. But when it comes to ideas, please, mommy and daddy, dean, president, protect us from these dangerous ideas, these subversive ideas. Well, I grew up during McCarthyism, and I remember when people on the other side were suppressing subversive ideas. And the last thing I want to see is safe places for ideas. If you want to feel good, get a massage. If you want to have good mental health, go to see a psychiatrist. But if you want to have your ideas challenged, if you want to learn how to think, come into that classroom, ready to argue. I have to tell you a story about a student, probably not too popular here and not somebody I would vote for, but I had a student named Ted Cruz in my first year class in criminal law. He walked into that class with his right hand up in the air. He wasn't your classmate, was he? He was a little
year ahead.
Year ahead. Came in with his right hand up, you know, waving the whole time.
Not the left.
Not the left. Never raised his left hand. And constantly upset and offended the students in the class because and he was very unpopular, and I had to really go out of my way to protect him because the students would boo. They would play Gunner Bingo. Do you remember that game? They would play a game where every time Cruz spoke, some bingo thing would be put in place. But he was a very valuable person to have in class Because it turns out half of America supports his views, or 30% of America supports his views. None of them are at Harvard Law School. But you want to hear those different views expressed so that you can combat them, you can respond to them. But students today, many of them, don't want to hear contentious ideas.
Alan, one of the things you just mentioned is that, you know, it's important to be an advocate.
Yeah.
But when you're teaching lawyers, the advocacy that you have practiced over your career has not just been in a courtroom. In fact, that's probably the minority of circumstances when you've done it.
Yeah.
One of the things in your book, and I'm bringing it back to the book again, is a lot of examples you give, both from your own experience and that of other people you profile, about lawyerly action by either non-lawyers but outside of the courtroom. And would you talk about some of the things that you've sort of prized over your career that you have done outside of the traditional legal process?
Well, I teach my students that advocacy is just as important outside the classroom in the courtroom as in the courtroom. I've had about 300 appeals that I've argued, and that's been advocacy in the courtroom. But advocacy outside, everywhere you go, you have to be an advocate. You want a job, you have to persuade the hiring partner that you're the person for the job. You want a promotion, you have to persuade. You're trying to negotiate a deal, you have to persuade. Now, you do use different advocacy skills. I'll give you an example. So I was asked to debate against the boycott, divestment, sanction movement regarding Israel at the Oxford Union. And I was told I would be greeted with a very unfriendly audience, that there have been about 100 debates regarding Israel at the Oxford Union, and the Israel side never wins. So they said, don't expect, we don't want you to be disappointed, don't expect anything. And I said, hey, I have nothing to lose. If nobody there supports Israel, at least they'll have a chance to listen to my point of view as a moderate, peace-loving, two-state solution, end of the settlements person for years. Let me present my perspective. And I decided to make the case against the BDS movement based on the values of the students in the audience, and argue that the BDS movement made peace more difficult because it encouraged the Palestinians to look to BDS rather than to negotiate in a compromised way. I argued that it makes war more likely, and I used all of the values of the students, and at the end, remarkably, we won the debate. And the students at the Oxford Union voted overwhelmingly on our side because I gave them a way of voting that way without compromising their values. And so I thought hard about that for several reasons. One, my wife, who's here today, was in the audience, and I always want to impress her because I met her at one of my speeches. And my granddaughter, who's a student at Oxford, was in the audience, and she had never heard me debate. So I really worked hard on this debate. And advocacy always depends on the audience. A tree in the forest falls, sound, the old story. The point is, you never are advocating in the abstract. And the two things I teach my students about advocacy is always remember who your audience is and remember who you're trying to persuade. And the other thing is, you don't ever try to imitate anybody else's style or approach. Figure out who you are. Figure out what makes you comfortable, what you do best. I've seen some of the best oral advocates in front of the Supreme Court. You clerked in front of the Federal District Court, in front of the Court of Appeals, so you've seen many advocates. I've seen some of the best advocates. Some are extremely soft-spoken. The judges practically have to lean into here. Some are very voluble. The only ones that are no good is the phonies, the ones who are trying to adopt a style that's not their style. So you have to figure out who you are. You have to be authentic. When you're up there, you have to be yourself. And I think those two have been keys to at least the way I've tried to advocate over the years.
Well, since you mentioned knowing your audiences, it might be an opportunity now to open it up to some questions.
Sure.
If folks have questions. I think that there's 2 microphones.
Let's have a conversation now, okay?
Hi, Mr. Dershowitz. Thank you for coming here today. I don't know if it's on. It's not on. I met you 30 years ago for about 5-10 minutes at Nova Law School in Fort Lauderdale.
I remember being there, yeah.
With Dean Lewis.
Yeah.
I love your books. I love your stuff. Thank you. You're a
Thank you.
supporter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. So
Great.
tell us some of your favorite judges.
That's a short list. I could tell you some of my least favorite judges. That'll be a long list. Most of my favorite judges are judges I never met, not surprisingly. Justice Brandeis, of course, has to rank above anybody. He was probably the greatest judge in American history and probably the greatest all-around lawyer in American history. He and Lincoln, probably, you really have to have a competition. Brandeis was a very different kind of lawyer. You probably know he went to Harvard Law School at a time when almost no Jews ever went. He was a German Jew from Kentucky. He not only finished first in his class, but still nobody has broken his record for the highest grades in the history of Harvard. He became then the greatest lawyer in Boston, and he became a cause lawyer. He was a lawyer for the people. He helped create savings bank life insurance, which created competition for the life insurance companies. He was a lawyer to try to defend what ultimately became the New Deal, and that is limited hours for workers, minimum wages for workers. He wrote all the Brandeis briefs, which today you read any brief, it's a Brandeis brief essentially. It's not just a sterile legal document, but it gets into the heart of the matter. So I think he's my favorite judge. My favorite contemporary judge, maybe Stephen Breyer. I've known him so many years. We're close friends. He's a real mensch. He's a very, very decent man who always tries to do the right thing. One of my closest friends, you clerked for, Mark Wolf, is a great judge, a man of tremendous courage. You had the fortune to work on a case that may be one of the most important exposés. Any of you who've seen the movie Black Mass or The Departed know about Whitey Bulger. Well, it was Mark Wolf with you as his law clerk that really exposed the intimate connections between the master criminal Whitey Bulger, the FBI, and in fact, the man who introduced us today, we had a little conflict last year. Are you still here? Okay, so I'll give you a chance to respond, but we had a little conflict last year because I helped the prosecution in a case. I've only helped the prosecution in one case ever, and it was the case against John Connolly. John Connolly was the corrupted FBI agent who used to tell Whitey Bulger who the rats were so that Whitey Bulger could then kill them. And so this is an FBI agent. And the Innocence Project took on his case. And in the end, I think the case may still be pending. When it's here in Miami, and which was fine. But we were on opposite sides of a very interesting case. I think at the moment we're winning, but I think there's still some litigation. Okay, we'll talk about the result later. Right, good.
Okay, I don't know if anybody else, I've heard so many lectures, I'm not sure if I'll be coherent, but I'm going to try. When you talked about Ted Cruz and not having discourse with the law students, I don't know about anybody else, but I find that today, among adults as well, it's very difficult to talk politics. We used to be able to talk politics and glean something from the other side. As I said, how do you feel about that? I don't see that as happening, where I would say maybe 20, 30 years we were able to have a discourse.
I agree with you. No, I completely agree with you. Look, the man I was closest to in my adult life in politics was Ted Kennedy, and Ted had a sign in his office, which he would tell anybody whenever there was anything involving human rights or civil liberties, it was call Allen. So we worked very closely on many of these matters over the years. And the one marvelous thing about Ted Kennedy is he talked to everybody. His closest friends in the Senate were Republicans, Orrin Hatch, people like that. And he could talk across the aisles. And there were so many in those days, senators, congressmen, who could really talk across the aisles. And that's become very hard. And the fault is widespread. Look, our president, who I voted for twice, is petulant, childish when it comes to his enemies. He doesn't like criticism. He could not get along with many of the leaders. I mean, not only Netanyahu, but many of his friends he's turned against if they criticize him at all. He's very, very thin-skinned. And it's a tragedy because presidents also have to reach across. Bill Clinton was fantastic that way. He could talk to anybody. Anybody could talk to him. Not so much President Obama. I wrote a book recently called The Case Against the Iran Deal. I every year I've been invited to, I'm always invited to the White House for meetings with the president, for parties, Hanukkah parties. Believe me, I do not expect ever again to be invited to the White House, because I've written a book critical of the president's policies. Not so much critical of him, but critical of his policies. And that's the way he is. The spat between Netanyahu and Obama is just unforgivable. And there's plenty of fault to go around. But leaders of countries should not be involved in that kind of petulant, childish back and forth. We need greater maturity from our leaders. We need greater maturity from our elected officials. And sometimes I hear it from judges. You go in front of judges, they're petulant and they're impossible, and they think they own the world. And your point is very, very well taken, that we need to get back to a point where we can have real dialogue and real conversation. And I have to tell you, I'm not optimistic, because the current group of student leaders around college campuses aren't. The vice president of one of the major colleges in the Midwest made a statement on television the other day. She said, I don't want to hear any more about the First Amendment. Well, then go to Iran. You won't hear anything about the First Amendment. But if you live in America and are on a university campus, a university public campus, you're going to hear about the First Amendment, my friend. Okay.
On the subject of colleges and universities being a very important and special place for the free and open discussion of ideas, are there any outer limits? The Islamic State wants to take a full-page ad in a campus newspaper. Another group wants to burn a cross in the quadrangle. Another group wants to ride on horses, all hooded in white, up and down the campus. Are there any limits that should be recognized?
I do think so, yeah. And I've written a lot about that. I think that whatever the limits are, they have to be absolutely equal for all sides. You cannot have affirmative action in speech. You cannot have more speech for people of color. You cannot have more speech for women. You cannot have more free speech for gay, lesbian, and transgender people. The rules have to be identical, symmetrical. I talk about it as the circle of civility. If a university wants to say that there can't be, and there are also time, manner, and place locations. You can't walk into a church in the middle of a service and start screaming, God is dead. You can't walk into a classroom and disrupt the teacher or the students. But if we're talking about what can go on a campus, universities can have reasonable rules, and they can have reasonable rules that talk about incitements. It's very hard to define. One of the first cases I ever took, I wrote about it in my book, The Best Defense. One of the first cases I ever took involved an awful man named Franklin, who was a professor at Stanford University, a tenured professor at Stanford University, who was a Maoist and a Stalinist, and he actually had pictures on his desk of Stalin and Mao, and those were his heroes. And he didn't want anybody to have free speech, but he wanted free speech, and he made a speech calling for the shutting down of the computer center and urged students in ambiguous terms to engage in violence. And he had his tenure denied. I represented him on behalf of the American Civil Liberties Union. And we ended up resolving the case. He decided he moved on to another university, Rutgers University. But there could be limits, but the limits have to be stated in reasonable and symmetrical ways. And they're very hard. It's very hard. I was assigned to be on Harvard's committee to come up with a speech code. And I volunteered to be on the committee because I said, look, if we're going to ban speech, I don't want to ban speech at all, but if we're going to ban it, I'd rather have a code than give the dean the power to decide after the fact what should be banned and what shouldn't. And one of the reasons I wanted to be on the committee is I knew they could never come up with any concept. And they couldn't. They gave up after 2 years. Take, for example, the use of the N-word. Obviously, if a teacher calls on a black student and calls him by the N-word, that teacher should be fired. The same thing if a teacher calls a Jew by the K-word or a woman by, I'm not even going to get into it. But you cannot abuse students in that way. But we have to have a uniform rule for everybody. But then the question was, could a teacher use the N-word in teaching? And one of our colleagues, Randy Kennedy, wrote a book, and the title was the N-word, not the N-word, but the title was N-I-G, spelled out the N-word. That was the book. And he would teach it in class. Well, you can't. So one student said, well, okay, let's have a rule. Anybody who's black can use the N-word, but anybody who's not can't. Well, there was a debate about that. So in the end, we could not come up with any reasonable, symmetrical circles of civility. But I completely agree with you that there is if not a speech code, there is speech common law. There are things we all know you cannot say in a university. And it would be good if we could codify that, but at the moment, it's very, very difficult to do. But it's an excellent question. Yeah.
Dr. Dershowitz, the first time I had the pleasure of hearing you talk was in 1979 in Brooklyn.
Uh-huh.
During the campaign for Teddy Kennedy.
Right, yeah.
As a Goyim, one thing that concerns me about Israel is the fact that members of the PLO that tend to be more secular than zealot are dying off. Yet right now Israel refuses to negotiate with them. So I just want to hear you.
Oh, I strongly believe that Israel should negotiate with the Palestinian Authority. Benjamin Netanyahu has announced that he is willing with no preconditions to do it. I've actually urged Prime Minister Netanyahu, who I've known for a long time, to offer his own peace plan now, and to offer a peace plan much like the one that Ehud Barak offered and was turned down by Yasser Arafat, and the one that Ehud Olmert offered in 2008, with modifications, changes, things change over time. And let the Palestinians at that point either reject or accept or come back to the negotiating table. This is a perfect time for Israel to make an offer. Why? Israel must create alliances with the Emirates and with the Sunni Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, against Iran. And they can't really become full partners with Israel as long as there's outstanding issues with the Palestinian Authority. So I think at this point, it'd be a wonderful time for Israel to make an offer. And by the way, nobody should be ever afraid of criticizing Israeli policies. Criticism of Israeli policies is not anti-Semitic. If it were, the largest concentration of anti-Semites in the world would live in Tel Aviv. They are the most critical of Israel's policies, and the most anti-Semitic newspaper in the world would be Haaretz. So criticism of Israel's policy, good thing. Just like criticism of America's policies, a good thing. French policies, a good thing. British policies, speaking about French policies, so interesting. The tragedy of France was horrible. Of course, Iran said it was the Jews who did it. And by the way, a Palestinian Authority paper said the Jews did it too. So, Jews did everything bad. You know that. That starts with Abraham. But the notion that, you have to make peace with your enemies, but you have to make peace with them on terms that preserve your security. I think that's doable. I'm glad you reminded me of being in Brooklyn with Ted Kennedy. I had a great time with him. I campaigned all over the country for Ted Kennedy in 1979, 1980, I guess. That was to make repentance for the fact that I had campaigned for Jimmy Carter 4 years earlier. But I have to tell you, I voted for Jimmy Carter a second time, too. That's another vote I've come to regret. But I also went to Martha's Vineyard for the first time in my life. Really, the first time I ever met Ted Kennedy, I guess, was I got a phone call on, I think, July 29th, was it 68 or 9? I can't remember now, from his chief of staff saying the senator's driven off a bridge. Can you get to the island as soon as possible? And I got there, and I was part of his defense team. And that tragedy resonated for the rest of his life. I mean, I think, but for that tragedy, he probably would have been president of the United States. Yeah.
Okay. A majority of governors have taken a position against the immigrants, the refugees in the Middle East. And of course, there's a bill going through, passed by the House and going to the Senate against it. I was wondering if you could talk about the legalities of, who has the right to decide about whether they come or don't come.
Okay, you have exactly as much power as any governor to prevent immigrants from coming to the United States. The governors have zero power. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments of the Constitution provide that anybody who can live in one state can go to another state. We do not have borders. In our country, governors have no impact on who can come to Florida, who can come to Georgia, and there are no border crossings. No governor can keep anybody out of the country. That is purely a national issue. Purely a national issue. Congress does have the authority to do that. Here's my position on it, and it is between the extremes. So far, what we've done is conflated two issues. One, rescuing these poor folks from Syria, children, widows, old people. That's the number one priority. Number two is allowing them to become full American citizens and live here for the rest of their lives. Those are two completely separate issues. Our first priority is to get them out of Syria, to make sure they're out of harm's way. People make the analogy all the time to the St. Louis when 900 Jews from Germany tried to land in the United States. They weren't trying necessarily to become citizens. They were actually hoping to go back to Germany after, Hitler was out of power. They just needed a place to live. They needed a place of asylum. And our first priority and the constant must be they have to be given a place of asylum. Now, wouldn't it be better, ideally, if they could move to Saudi Arabia for the next 2 or 3 years? Saudi Arabia has no people and unlimited land. They could easily, and same language, same religion, actually same even sub-religion, they're all Sunnis, and they could live there for 2 or 3 years, work there, and then if Syria ever gets stabilized and returns to being Syria, they could go back and help rebuild their country. Those who want to become American citizens should apply to become American citizens, but we should separate out the issue of rescue from the issue of full citizenship. But having said that, the United States has to be the default country when it comes to rescuing. We have the Statue of Liberty, we have the history of immigration, and in the end, if the only way of rescuing them is to allow them to come into this country, we have to do that, but we should also consider middle ground alternatives.
Alan, can I just ask something?
Sure.
So what about the security concern that you hear so much advocated on television?
Okay, look, the security concerns are real. So far, we've had no problems with refugees. Refugees who come have to go through a very, very rigorous screening process. The real problem is with tourists who can come in very easily. People who come as refugees are much less likely to come with bad intentions than people who come in other ways or who cross over illegally. So I think we have to have very, very tough screening mechanisms, and we have to make sure that we do the best we can. But again, with the Abraham story, Abraham, after he argued with God, and God said if there are 50 innocent, all right, if there are 40, 30, Abraham stops with 10, because there's no such thing as perfect justice, and there's no such thing as perfect safety. What we have to do is balance safety against justice. And it seems to me that the procedures we have in place now for screening people coming in is pretty good. It's a heck of a lot better than what we have in place now for screening people who work at airports. People who work at airports now get no greater screening than I had to go through to get my little TSA quick pass that allows me to keep my shoes on. That's the only screening they get. And if you talk about vulnerability, the plane that went down over the Sinai was almost certainly brought down by somebody who worked for the airline and who wasn't screened and who was able to put a bomb on the plane. We don't know that for sure, but we know that the people who work today and get security clearance for our airports have far less screening than the refugees would get. So I think some of the refugee issue is pure bias. I'll give you another example of that. The thing that really, really gets my goat are these people who say, I bake cakes or I cater, and I cannot bake a cake for a gay couple that wants to get married because of my religion. That is such a phony argument. I happen to know the New Testament quite well. I teach both the New Testament and the Old Testament in a course that I teach on scriptural sources of justice. Jesus was adamant about one thing relating to marriage. If you've been divorced, you can't remarry. That is the most fundamental rule of Christianity. Has anybody ever heard of somebody not wanting to bake a cake for a divorced couple that wanted to get married? There's nothing in the New Testament about gays. Nothing about gay marriage. And yet, all these phonies invoke religion to say, I won't bake a cake, but even the woman who was down in wherever she was, who refused, she herself had been divorced 4 times and remarried. What a great Christian she was. But, you know, so I think oftentimes religion is used as a cover for anti-gay bigotry, just as I think security is often used as a cover for anti-Muslim bigotry. And so we have to separate out the bigotry which we all have in one form or another, consciously or unconsciously. And we have to adapt. We have to adapt. You know, this stuff in Texas where they wouldn't pass a human rights statute because it meant that men would go into women's bathrooms. Right here in this building, the bathroom that I went to today was a unisex bathroom. It had urinals, and it had stalls, and men and women. It didn't ask you whether you're a man or a woman. You went to the bathroom, you picked your stall. We can solve all these problems. But when bigotry gets in the way, it muddles the brain. And we stop thinking rationally and logically. And bigoted thinking is the opposite of clear thinking.
Just a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
But first, I'd like to thank you very much. It's been a privilege to.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
My question is, one, what is on your reading list today? You know, other than the Bible, what other book has influenced you the most? And secondly, I'm curious, with the advocacy and your brilliant mind, have you ever wanted to delve into politics, or have you?
Oh no.
turned down the position?
I've turned down a number of, I could write a book about what I haven't done. Ted Kennedy offered me a possibility of a judgeship when I was fairly young, and I thought about that and decided my mother would be very happy, but I wouldn't. And I've done enough for my mother. I kept kosher for 27 years. I didn't have to become a judge. You know, I thought about it a few times, but you know, I'm iconoclastic. I have my own ideas. I would not be a successful politician. I was offered college presidencies when I was young, and you know, presidency. That's one I wish now somebody would offer me. I would love to stand up to these bullies in college, but that's not going to happen. But when I was, huh?
No president has offered you in the past as a cabinetry?
No. I'm a little too controversial for all of that. So, you know, I like living a life as an iconoclast, as somebody who doesn't have to answer to anybody but my wife and my family, and it's a nice feeling. So, you had another question?
Yes, sir. What other books are on?
Oh, you know, I just read a book that everybody said I wouldn't like, and I liked it a lot. I read the novel "Go Call a Watchman" by the same woman who wrote, and I actually liked it better than To Kill a Mockingbird. What I didn't like about To Kill a Mockingbird was that the defendant was innocent. It would have taken a lot more courage to write a book about a brave guy in town who really represents somebody who may not be innocent. And of course, we now learn in the second book that Atticus Fitch, who is all of our heroes, you know, holds some uncomfortably racist views. But I thought this other book was very nuanced and beautifully written. So I enjoyed reading it very much. I read everything now on my iPhone on Kindle, and so you know, I love reading. I like reading fiction, nonfiction. So thanks for your question. Good. Yeah.
Probably have time for a couple more questions.
Okay.
So.
Yeah.
I'm embroiled in an argument with my son. I'm Jew. My son has not.
Okay. Yeah. Right. By the way, every character in the Bible is embroiled in an argument with their son, so you're in very, very good company, but tell us the story. Right.
I find myself quite upset, with good reason. And my son is one of the people you talked about who are in the majority and find Israel guilty of every sin ever created.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could share some of the arguments that you brought against those people who are in my son's class,
Right.
who can't stand Israel, even though he is a Jew himself.
Right. Well, some of Israel's most, you know, people who are most enemies of Israel are Jews, of course. Noam Chomsky, Norman Finkelstein, people like that. Has your son been to Israel?
No,
See, I think that's the one deal I would make with him. And the first city I would take him to is not Jerusalem. I wouldn't take him to the Wall. I wouldn't take him to Tel Aviv. I would take him to Ramallah, the head of the Palestinian Authority. And he would see something that would shock him. Ramallah is a beautiful open city. You never see an Israeli guard. You never see an Israeli policeman. You never see an Israeli soldier. You see high-tech stores. You see Mercedes and BMW cars. And you see a real Palestinian city thriving. Then you take him to Jericho, and you see much the same thing. It's not as wealthy a city. And then I would take him, then you take him to the checkpoints, and you see how difficult it is if you're a Palestinian. But he should, if it's possible to do that, try to go and meet as many people as possible from all sides. And when I take my students there, if I could take them to the Gaza, I would take them to the Gaza too. I can't, obviously, with safety these days. Look, it's very, very difficult. Many young people share your son's points of view, and I think you have to keep the dialogue open. You have to respect him. You have to respect his point of view. You have to love him, and you have to not cut off contact with him, and ultimately persuade him. Now, my debate at the Oxford Union will be on YouTube in about a week, and so you'll be able to see for yourself the arguments that I made and the arguments the other person made. And he may very well agree with the other person's arguments, but the other person who was arguing for the BDS movement also said that there are many, many countries in the world far worse than Israel. The challenge I threw out, by the way, to all the Oxford students and to my opponent is I said I want everybody in the audience to listen and to shout out an answer to this question. I want you all to think of any country in the history of the world faced with threats comparable to those faced by Israel, that has had a better record of human rights, a higher compliance with the rule of law, and more concern for the safety of civilians. I said, all right, I'm waiting. I waited. Nobody shouted out a country. I said, please, any country, name a country. Nobody. I turned to my opponent, name a country. Finally, as a joke, somebody in the back yelled, Iceland. And of course, he made the point. You know, Iceland hasn't had a war in 900 years. And probably doesn't have quite as good a record on civil liberties and human rights. But you look at what's going on in France today. France has 2 terrorist attacks, and already they've denied more civil liberties than Israel did after 100 years of terrorist attacks. And so, you know, you have to understand, no country is perfect. Having said that there's no country better than Israel in terms of these 3 criteria, I would still give Israel only a B-. And that's with great inflation. It could do a lot better. But so could every other country in the world. Look how we reacted after 9/11 with the Patriot Act. That was not the paradigm of civil liberties. And look at how we're reacting now with congressmen passing a law restricting immigration. So I think what you have to ask your son to do is to engage in some comparative perspective and ask him what he would do if he were the czar, if he were the newly elected czar of Israel, could do whatever he could do, and just continue the dialogue. It's very difficult. I know I have friends, relatives who are that way as well. When I won the debate at Oxford, my opponent wrote an op-ed saying, oh, the reason Dershowitz won is because he brought his whole family with him and they voted. Well, the family consisted of 2 people, my wife and my granddaughter. I'm pretty confident how my wife voted, but I'm not positive how my granddaughter voted.
I'm being told we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Sorry to the gentleman.
Sorry.
We may be able to sneak it in, so.
Okay. Yeah.
Nothing personal.
Sure.
But being that you regretted twice or 3 times on the candidate that you voted for, who do you think you're going to vote for this time?
Okay, that's a fair question. Look, I'm a liberal Democrat, so presumptively I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton. I'm going to wait to see who the other candidates are. I have met Governor Bush, who I like very much. I have met Senator Rubio, who I like. I want to see a good, strong Republican candidate who I would be comfortable with as president. That does not include Donald Trump. It does not include Ben Carson. And I would wait and see what the lineup is. But presumptively, I'm a liberal Democrat. I don't think I've ever voted for a Republican for president in my life. But that could change. I have said the Senate needs one Ted Cruz. He must remain in the Senate. He is a very important voice in the Senate. That's my position on Ted Cruz, and he knows it. Yeah.
I wanted to segue on that last.
Sure.
I'm Republican. My wife has done pro bono work for the ACLU
Right.
for 10 years, so we have a balance in our family. The paradox I find is my closest liberal friend is an emergency room doctor in Berkeley is so liberal he goes off the map. I mean, he makes Bernie look like Trump, and he is now a staunch Republican advocate. The paradox I find is the lack of support of the Democrats for the state of Israel, and yet Jews typically vote Democrat.
It's a good question.
I don't know whether it's the balance of the pro-choice issues overcoming the issues of Zionism or not, but I'm just puzzled why Jews.
It's a puzzle.
Democrat.
It's a puzzle. So I'm writing a book called Why I Left the Left But Couldn't Join the Right. And I think I represent a lot of people probably in this room. I am a liberal Democrat on domestic issues. I could never vote for a candidate who denies a woman the right to choose, who denies gays the right to marry, who is against gun control, who doesn't believe in separation of church and state, who would appoint extreme right-wingers to the Supreme Court. I just can't bring myself to vote for anybody like that, but I can't vote for somebody who's anti-Israel. So my job is to maintain my position as a strong pro-Israel Democrat and do everything I can within the Democratic Party to make sure that at least the leaders of the Democratic Party remain pro-Israel. Israel must always remain a bipartisan issue. It can't ever become a wedge issue. And that was the problem this year with the conflict between Netanyahu and Obama. So I want to restore the situation where the Democrats, at least the elected Democrats, are a strongly supportive of Israel. Look, Bernie Sanders comes from Brooklyn, my age, a nice guy, I like him. He's pretty good. I mean, he's pretty strongly pro-Israeli. I may disagree with him on a few things. He thought Israel overreacted during the Gaza war, but he's about as far left as you get in the Democratic Party. But you're absolutely right that young Democratic voters tend to be far less pro-Israel than Republican voters. Now, there's another problem with that. For me, some Republican voters are too extreme on the right in support of Israel. That is, they don't support the two-state solution. They would like to see Israel maintain control over the West Bank. I want to see Israel maintain control over the Golan. I've changed my views on that. I used to be one who was prepared to say it should be given back. By the way, the decision should be made by Israelis, not by Americans, not by Jews, not by anybody else, but it should be made by Israelis, Israeli Jews, Israeli Christians, Israeli Arabs, Israeli citizens. I don't think Israelis are prepared now to surrender the Golan. Who would they surrender it to? ISIS? Assad? Who knows who they would surrender it to? But so on the right, people who support Israel support it in ways that I find uncomfortable. And on the left, so I'm an uncomfortable Jew. Headline, uncomfortable Jew. Boy, that's a new thing. And I think a lot of people in my generation feel the same way. We're domestically very, very liberal. We can't give that up. On the other hand, from a foreign policy point of view, we're somewhat disappointed in at least the current administration and in the way trends for young people exist within the Democratic Party. Look, the reason I wrote my book about Abraham is because these are long-term issues. The issues that Abraham raised in his confrontations with God, with Pharaoh, with his father, are enduring issues. They won't go away. They're enduring. They're going to stay with us for a long time. And so, I thank you all for your great questions. I look forward to signing some of your books. And thank you.
And I hope you'll come back to future events here.
And thanks for your great questions.